This is June 2nd, 2017 in Vienna in the Hotel Danielle, and we're going to have a conversation about our trip to Hartheim. We are now recording. So I guess you said you had some things to process, Rosemary, about Hartheim. You want to say something first?
Well, what we saw at Hartheim together was some familiar images that those of us who've studied either the Holocaust Museum exhibit on Nazi medicine or the kinds of images that come up when you study T4 or eugenics or Nazi medicine. Those are fairly familiar images to many of us, but there were new images for us and new documents, and that seemed very important to me. I was particularly taken, as we all were, with that American photograph. It was a large photograph of a kind of eugenics bulletin board with flashing lights that would indicate when a normate, understood as someone who would contribute leadership and creativity, was born, and when they didn't use the word degenerate, but almost would be born. And that was really useful for us, and we recorded that. But the other thing that struck me, and it's part of the way you represent. So these are issues of representation. Individual human beings. So one of the things that we saw that represented the particularity and the individuality of the thousands of people who are killed there is through two conventions. One is the convention of the names, so the lists of names. And the other convention, three conventions. The second convention is the photographs. So we saw a lot of individual photographs. We saw a lot of names. And the other method of representing the individual is through, I guess, synecdoche, if you will, and that is the personal objects and items. Mm-hmm. So those were three modes of memorialization that are very conventional. If you go to a Holocaust museum, you see the same thing. The suitcases, the hair, the pictures, the names. Those were conventional modes that I think we're accustomed to seeing. And then those modes of representing individuality and particularity are in contrast, vivid contrast, to the calculation representation that we saw. And we were familiar with some of the Nazi T4 propaganda posters where, it cost 60,000 Reichsmarks to support this, and they'd have a kind of cartoonish illustration. We'd seen a lot of those kinds of calculations where an illustration is given an economic value. Mm-hmm. But what was most revelatory to me, and I think to both of us, was the stash of charts that the American Army, the major, had found that had been forgotten, left behind.
They call them the Hartheim statistics.
The Hartheim statistics, thank you, which were these charts done with colored pencils and graph paper, basically. Yeah. Several of them, and typing in an old-fashioned, I don't know what you call it, typewriter that produced typeface. Mm-hmm. that had a variety of different modes of representing the people in the aggregate that T4 killed. So these were the opposite of the representations of the particularity. So we had something like the lists of the T4 killing sites and how many people were killed, help me out, on what day, at what site, and what month. So it was a calculus, a mode of representation that was based on numbers and on calculation, in which individuals were put into groups in order to dissolve their differentiation from one another and make them into an aggregate of some kind. So these were all the people killed in this month at Hadamar.
Yeah.
So it became an aggregate.
Yeah. And then even put on the plot line.
Right, and there were different representations, which were statistical or numerical representations, whether it was a chart or a number or a graph of some kind. And then three of us were particularly astonished by this one representation, which was a chart listing maybe 20 different food groups. And there was a calculation.
Was broad at the top? Broad. I think bread was at the top.
It was close to the top.
Yeah.
Butter was in there. I noticed that.
Yeah.
But these food groups were listed, and the chart showed
The savings.
the amount of money projected that would have been saved as a result of killing disinfecting, that was the verb, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Disinfecting X number of people on a certain date cumulatively in 1941 when the chart was produced, and then projecting that savings in each category of food, which of course is that which is incorporated into the individual bodies of the vanished people.
Yeah.
So that there was a grand total, a calculation projected into 1951 of how much money the killings would have saved the regime. And it was that projection that struck me as something different from what I had seen before.
Yeah.
Although we did see other projections about eugenic projections, if this kind of person has this kind of child and this kind of person has that kind of child, what's going to happen if the less valuable people reproduce more quickly than the more valuable people?
Yeah.
But this business of what we eat, what we consume, what we take into ourselves as individuals to produce the bodies that we are, that kind of calculation about how, and this is characteristic of modernity, our belief that actions taken in the present will control outcomes in the future. So it's a prognosis move, which is what all medicine is based on, right?
Yeah.
So the idea that we have lives not worth living, that we suffer, all of the...
That we're useless eaters.
That we're useless
This
eaters.
was the useless eaters chart for sure.
Yeah.
That we have low quality of lives, that all of the rationales for eugenic euthanasia or eugenics, whether it's the old eugenics or the new eugenics, are based on this concept of calculation. So the utilitarian philosophers who argue that we have the moral obligation to have the best children possible are using a model of differential value and projection into the future.
Yeah.
In other words, what will determine the best child to have the best life is this kind of a projection.
Yeah. So I just, because I actually pulled the chart up here on my phone, so just to narrate some of this right. So they were taking roughly 70 people and then projecting it 10 years out. And then at the bottom of the chart, it went all the way to 1951, a little bit further. Won't be surprised, the number one, of course, and they started by like the heaviest weight in terms of food value, Kartoffel, potatoes, right? But so it tells you the total kilograms that would be saved if from those 70 people, and then the total cost, and then out the projected cost in 10 years. So the projected cost across those 20-some food categories, if 70 people would be eating, that what you would save in 10 years' time was 141,775,573 Reichsmarks.
And it's this kind of statistical person, if you will, that we have with our understanding of what is, okay, I've got to work with my mouth. There is something in bioethics where you calculate a loss of, now I can't think of it now.
Yeah.
It's I know. It's a quality of life.
Yeah.
QOL.
Yes.
Calculation, where if somebody has, I don't know, one hand cut off, it reduces life quality. It's all numerical.
Yeah.
By such and such.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same kind of thing.
Yeah. So when you say that too, what I've, because I was standing there, so they calculate those, and then it's just as much rhetorically telling that they don't calculate, so they add up the numbers of people killed, but they don't further out calculations like they did in minutia for that. Because I pulled up my phone and saw the 18,600 some people killed at Hartheim in that 16-month period averaged out to 40.5 bodies per day. And they don't do those figures.
Right.
And I think that's, whether it's deliberate or not, but it's a kind of rhetorical. I mean, instead they're adding up what the consumption is rather than showing what the destruction is.
Oh.
Right? So it's selective even too, in terms of what's represented numerically, what's calculated. But I think that's a really good point about the calculation being an additional category. I mean, we talk about that in the field of rhetoric of science, number, the rhetorical impact of numbers, charts,
right.
graphs.
And there's that's interesting. I didn't know that because there's a lot, of course, written about the the rationalization, to use Max Weber's term, of people, where people become statistics, people become numbers, people become aggregate figures, which is part of industrialization. And this carries it further than almost anything else.
Yeah. Kind of in the same way, but in a flip, but also similar way, because you mentioned the names as one of the primary categories, and Hartheim did that more than any of the other sites I've been there. The two different names, what do we call them? Plaques, memorials that they did. So the one where you enter, over the iron wall where you enter, which has the names of all the locations that people came from.
Right.
I've not seen that representation before laid out. That was very powerful. Then just as much as the overwhelming wall, the glass panes where people, the 22,000 plus people so far since 2010. So they haven't put up new names since 2010, and they have empty glass bases still reserved. So there was this very compelling effect that had for me, in that it was this uber individual, like 22,000 names on those little glass etchings was a lot. but then to see them as a sum whole, the big aggregate had weight. And then their argument, which made sense, that they did not alphabetize the names because in honor of the family, there's sort of respect for the families that remain. But there's also not alphabetizing the names makes it this like this dizzying, you can't make sense of it effect.
Yeah.
Because like,
Right.
where would you start if you wanted to find
Yeah.
somebody's name? There
You'd
have to like
read through every name.
all 22,000,
Right.
pretty much, or decide.
I don't know how Austria does this, but in Germany, of course, if you go to the Bundesarchiv, there are the medical records of, I think they were 30,000 medical records from T4 that were discovered again in a back room after the unification of Germany around 1990. Someone found these 30,000 records, and they brought them to
The Bundesrat.
the Bundesarchiv. And the people who go in there and use those it's like the Holocaust Museum. They're searching for family. So they look under names, but they also look under locations because there was this geography of T4 that we see over and over again, and that is the moving around with technology, which is to say buses and trains as opposed to horses and walking, buses and trains that would move these people all around in order to disrupt any kind of human bond that these people might have with each other, with their families in their local town, or with the caretakers at the facilities. And this was necessary to achieve the anonymity that's necessary to put together a killing site where people come off of a bus and within 4 hours they're killed. So there's total anonymity amongst the people who arrive in relation to one another as they are gathered by the 100 in this gas chamber, and anonymity for the workers there that are doing this. And so that...
They didn't have time to make contact with them.
no one had time to have any kind of a human bond. So the sundering of all human communal relations, whether it's a kinship relation or a care relation or a community relation, those all get disrupted through using the transport technologies that they use to take people from their little village in Austria or Germany, transport them to Dachau, transport them to Hartheim, all in the interest of this anonymity, like people in modern urban settings where you walk the streets and spend the entire day never seeing another human being that you've ever seen before. That's very easy for us to do. Where, as we know, in pre-modernity, people were born in a village, lived in a village, died in a village. Generally speaking, no one went anywhere, so that there was no anonymity. And so the technologies of movement are what has created this possibility for the human bonds to be sundered.
Yeah, two points that pick up on that struck me. One was the recreation of the bus shed. And the other was the recreation of the screen in the arcade. So it was the breaking of sight lines, so that early on the buses drove up and people in the area noticed that people got off the buses, but then they didn't get back on the buses. So they built the shed. But the one that really struck me was the interior screen because that was to mask these activities from the people living in Hartheim who were employees of Hartheim. So they knew what was going on, but it was almost the sort of respite from awareness. If you were not on shift that day, you could pretend visually that it wasn't going on. But the other thing, and this speaks to Hartheim as a museum, in addition to a T4 memorial, and I was struck by, so it's a history museum. It's all about narrative, but it's also all about what are the visitors supposed to make of this history? How does that connect to today? And so I was interested in the sequence that you go through, presumably as a school group, right? And that it starts with this very earnest attempt to, have contemporary disabled people saying what, the video saying what is disability. So they're there. And then, and this goes back to your idea of technologies of mobility, the videos where they had the various people.
Yeah.
So we watched the one video where there's a little deaf girl of Turkish background, and she's wandering around trying to get to the Lilo, and we didn't know what that meant. Eventually it turns out to be a train station. And it's only there that somebody actually says, well, can you write down what you want?
Yeah.
And then she says she wants a ticket to Hartheim. And in a way, there was sort of a feeling of triumph because, at last the little girl is going to get what she wants. But at the same time thinking of, a ticket to Hartheim.
Exactly.
In 1940, for a little deaf girl, means death. So it was kind of a odd choice to have that series of videos, even though I think it was meant to be instructive. Look at all the barriers that disabled people face today. I mean, the other thing that struck me, though, about the historical part of it was that they did push forward an analysis of eugenics to encourage a critical reading of contemporary eugenic practices. That is to say, prenatal, because it went there.
It went there.
It went to prenatal and end-of-life questions.
Even Dolly the sheep.
And even Dolly the sheep. So it didn't leave this history in the dark past of Nazism. It sort of invited analysis of contemporary practices. And that I wasn't expecting exactly.
That was very impressive. I don't think that we saw any of that we didn't at Hartheim. I mean, at Hadamar. And I don't know now what they would be doing. But it was very comprehensive.
Among the many things I know I was struck by was the soundscape there. And it's so right, I don't hear everything, but then I think sometimes that what I do hear I pay kind of extreme attention to.
Yeah.
And again, having been in other places, so at Hartheim the sound just like echoes, reverberates, and it's about the castle itself. But of course, at this point, there could have been things they could have done acoustically to change it, but it creates this hollowness, this sense that things disappear. And then I'm going to add to that, because it was part of the whole fabric of the day, the sounds of the lunch break that we took. So we went to the cafe that's run by the people in the current Hartheim Institute for Developmentally Disabled. I guess I don't know what the rest of the title is, which is across the road, but they run the cafe on the site, and then of course they run a little gift shop. So there the sounds were outside, and of course the people that were there around the tables also taking their lunch break or just hanging out. There was a lot of noise, and we clearly were causing a kind of sonic psychic disturbance a little bit for them. Also. Because they were quite animated, several of them, by our presence. So those are kind of the sound of the place.
That picks up on, trying to imagine being an employee of Hartheim.
Yeah.
And so they had that wall of boards to block, so that they didn't see the people being herded through. But they would have heard. It's not as if those people would have been silent necessarily.
Yeah.
And as you say, it was very echoey.
Yeah.
And most of the time that we were there, we were the only people moving around that space. But if there were many people, I mean, even before T4, that people who would have been the residents, inmates, their sound of their voices and their moving around would have echoed through that central courtyard quite significantly.
And there was such a short distance between the shed where the buses drove in and that gas chamber.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
It felt like people would have had to be moving very quickly to undress everyone, get everyone undressed.
Yeah.
There
They
must
took,
have
they
been.
took photographs of everybody.
Yeah.
4 hours. So they never looked longer than 4 hours, and they never went more than, definitely was less than 50 meters, the whole space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? That
So it
was
must have been a very efficient operation.
Yeah.
Uh,
And yet, as you said, with much shrieking.
Yeah. It was also, so the other part of the sound too was just probably, and I'm sure Gabby, who was taking us on the last 2 hours of the tour, I mean, I think there were a couple points I caught where, she would talk to us about something, and then because there's all this stuff on the wall, and the general presumption is that, people are reading that as they go. So there's not actually a lot of, the time I was there before, except for when the kids came through, one part in the morning, it was pretty much me, and it was very quiet.
yeah.
And so Gabby talking to us sort of disrupted that usual silence, but then the fact that Rosemary and I were always stopping to read things for Georgina, and I think Gabby a couple of times was a little like, because she started to move us on to another room, and we would stop to read the things, and so it wasn't, I could tell it wasn't what she was expecting either, wasn't how her usual tours went. It was disrupted by sound. Pause. What else? Did you have other notes? Other things that I don't think we want to.
Well, one thing, speaking of Gabby, I was struck by how, in the beginning, she was talking a lot about, giving tours to kids. And we asked what was the best age, what was the ideal age, and she said 17, and that they don't let kids in under the age of 14.
Mm-hmm.
And she made a lot of points about the sort of making sure that the children in particular feel that it's disturbing, and so you want to make sure that they have, they feel less threatened or less upset. And then the other thing that brought that back to me was when we were in the bus shed, and she pointed out circular marks in the gravel.
Yeah.
And she said that it's very common with teenagers to shuffle their feet to express discomfort.
Yeah.
And so I was kind of struck by these marks made by contemporary visitors that still record some, distant relative of.
Yeah, and they had made that little, very Americanized emblem of the remembrance ribbon that we use,
Yeah.
Or,
Is it on?
mm-hmm, yeah.
Another thing I was struck by is the witnessing, because that's really what anyone is doing, going to these sites, these memorial sites or commemorative sites in general. And the concept of a kind of forced witnessing. which of course it isn't exactly, but to have the practice of bringing school groups through, as many as possible, as an educational project, but it's also an enforced witnessing.
Yeah.
And I was remembering the footage that's so common that the Americans took at Buchenwald and the other places, the other big camps that the Americans liberated. And there was much footage of the forced witnessing that I think it was at Buchenwald, but maybe other places as well, that the Americans required the people from the communities to march through the camps and look at the bodies, and then that was filmed. And so what you can see the townspeople having to take responsibility for what happened in their town. It seemed quite brilliant to me that the Americans forced these townspeople to march through, and you can see how distressed they are, because it's these piles of bodies with the striped uniforms, piles and piles that fresh bodies that are being witnessed. And of course, that's much more dramatic than these highly structured witnessings. But there is something about marching the population through, that kind of a testimony, that kind of a witnessing that, as you say, is brought forward by the uncomfortable squirmings of the kids.
Yeah. But also, I'm wondering, as we know, the T4 program is not well known in the U.S.
Right.
Many people you can ask would say, oh, what's that? And yet we were told, I guess erroneously, that all Austrian children go to this site, but I guess a lot of them do.
No, they have, it's one of selections. They have to do something like that. But
and also she said that police officers have to go as part of their training. And
that
then,
seemed important.
Yeah, and then also people who are going into disability care professions.
Yeah.
That seems sort of obvious. But so one gathers that your average Austrian has some awareness of this history. And the effort that the museum as a narrative sequence was trying to make between contemporary living disabled people who are sort of on the wall, and that sort of final room that you come out where they're very colorful images of them in sort of everyday situations, and they're in a park and two of them are kissing and all these sorts of things.
Re-embedded in a life.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So that there was a very deliberate effort to say, oh, today it's, we want to include disabled people, because we understand this history. So the idea of the sort of what you're saying, the forced witnessing is now, in another iteration, a sort of less punitive, but still has this quality. Well, it's like all the Holocaust memorials, never forget.
Right.
So, but this is a different, how to get people not to forget in a less punitive way.
You have me thinking, so there was a moment and I decided because I didn't really want to talk about much at all last night after we left there, but in terms of witnessing and forced witnessing. So for me, there was something that was really, though, uncomfortable that was happening at the end of our journey in time there, because I was acutely aware that the clock was ticking, and we were literally 5 minutes from them closing, and we had not yet even gone through the chambers. And I don't know how much longer we would have lingered or whatever, but there was just a moment of tension for me, and that we were sort of very forced to again, by the machineries and technologies of time and their space and wanting not to be obligated, but we didn't actually get to linger with a reflection. Yes. And I don't know whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. Mm-hmm. It was just a tension again between the technologies of holding their time, and then holding our time.
I felt a tension in that series of rooms, from the undressing chamber to the antechamber to the gas chamber to the holding chamber for the bodies to the burning chamber, which is like a series of rooms attached rooms in an apartment. A dread, because I knew that what it was going to be like, because I'd been to the ones in Bernberg and Hadamar, that it was the climax of our visit, but also I think of almost everyone else's. Literally, it's not the denouement. It's the climax of the story. It's the catastrophe. So that when I got in there, I wanted to be very aware of a reverence and of a noting the experience. Yeah. I wanted to make sure that I noticed everything and I felt certain feelings, or at least was open to how I would feel. So it was a very hyper, at least for me, a very hyper-aware experience. Mm. But at the same time, I wanted to run out of that place screaming, get out of there as fast as I possibly could. Yeah. And I think maybe that's the nature of those really intensely anxiety-filled spaces in these journeys. Really, they're witnessing as a journey where you're going through something. Yes. So it's narrative, but it's also spatial, as opposed to like if you go to the Lincoln Memorial, you go in,
you read the thing,
you look at Lincoln, you stand there for a little while and think about it, turn around and leave. But the journey through these kinds of memorials is a different one. I mean, it has temporality and spatiality.
Yeah. And
that's distinctive.
And so I was aware of that again too, because there was another like tension, irony that was happening in that, which is okay, I guess. But so we were in the space, but even when we entered the space, the door on the other end of it was open. So where the crematoria and the ovens were, that door was open, which it would not have been at all. So there wouldn't even have been, there was always, even from the beginning, this sort of sense of a light at the end of the tunnel. You're going to get, could you get that light was coming from the other end?
Yeah, exactly.
Right around the corner, and the air was also moving through, because those both ends had doors that were open, which would not have been the case. At all. And I think our awareness, even though it's making you tense, there is like this still awareness that there's another door, there's a way out.
Yeah, there's a way out. Well, especially because they built that ramp, which I was glad she called attention to. So it was like the kind of elevated boardwalks that you see through botanical areas where you are slightly elevated above the earth or the terrain through which you are moving, because the terrain itself is fragile and unsupportive. Like if it's a swamp or something.
It reminded me of a cave.
A
trip to a cave or a trip to a mine.
A trip to a mine,
And the same
even though it was
quality.
only a few inches from the bottom of the ramp to the floor of the place, that the ramp was, it provided, at least for me, I think, a sense of kind of security, that you could move through there quickly if you had to, and you weren't going to get stuck anywhere.
Like guided you through. Right. Which they did to, protect the surface, because so many people walking on it would, erode the surface, but it did also create the direct path through, and of course it was wheelchair accessible.
Even though the museum as a whole, I don't know, was completely wheelchair accessible because there
No.
were steps in
Yes.
in each.
Yeah.
I mean, there were elevators, but at many thresholds there was like a elevated
Kind of irrational
yeah.
steps.
Well, that happened with access at many terms, like the over plastic things over the top that gave you outlines of things, which
Oh yeah.
Oh,
had
yeah,
an
talk
illusion
about
of
that.
connectability.
Oh yeah.
The ASL, the interpreters on the black and white TVs, which gave you the illusion of accessibility,
Yeah.
but still weren't.
Well, sometimes I've written about this. There are some access features which are almost, as you say, a display of accessibility, but not necessarily true access.
Do you think that the designers, I guess, of the museum, of those exhibits, really thought that those were accessible?
No, I think they were following guidelines. I mean, there are all sorts of different generations of guidelines about what to do, particularly to do with Braille and other tactile features. And so I think this was a few generations of
Yeah.
where everybody was doing it because you had this plastic and you could make those marks. But it's a very sighted understanding of, that you make an outline of the person's head.
Yeah.
And so when you feel it, you say, oh, okay, here's a head.
Right.
Yeah.
But it doesn't, there's no way that you can gain any sense of detail of even the expression or whatever it is that you get from looking at the photograph.
And since you already know what a head is.
Yeah. And even, for instance, they had one that was a raised outline of the castle itself, the image of the castle itself. And that sort of gives you, okay, so there's a tower here and a tower here and the door is here. But it's still a 2D, two-dimensional projection of a 3D object.
Right.
And I think ultimately it would be more beneficial to have a scale model that you could touch or something that would give you the floor plan and
Yeah.
I mean there's just an idea that what I've said this a million times, but that if you give the blind person something to touch, it will create an image in their mind's eye, right? But I'm not sure that every blind person, including myself, has a mind's eye.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily giving me additional information that is useful or meaningful.
And likewise, so I know that it's at least 10, and I think more like 15 years since the original exhibit was built. And so they had added on, there was one TV screen where they had added on some videos of the people's stories, the Wurstbaden project that they had. But other than that, it remained even from 4 years ago. And I made comments the last time, and I guess it just is what it is. That they laid down a template. They worked to do something, because the same thing works for the sign language videos.
Yeah.
And these funky old TVs and black and white. And while German students and Austrian students might be still using sign language, again, they're still being educated. And so reading captions actually would be their primary template. And none of their videos in the shop, nothing was captioned.
Yeah.
Plus there was a way, I don't want to critical, but only the entry placard to each room had any English with it.
Right.
And I have to think, how hard could it be at this point to give an English translation for all that other?
Well, it boils down to a calculus of the expense. And for them, I think that and the calculus of who's the imagined audience.
Yeah.
So since I think they perceive the majority of visitors are going to be Austrian citizens and particularly high school students. So everything's kind of geared to that. And I don't know, we could look on their website to see if they have scheduled tours for deaf students, with sign language or other things. But I don't think it's that they have an expectation of sort of drop-in international tourists. And I think where there was the most English was in the, from the bus gate through the gas chamber, So I think a lot of if there are English speaking visitors or international visitors, they're most likely to just go through that section and not go through upstairs into the more detailed pedagogical sections.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I mean, I think it probably. I mean, yeah, she was saying that they probably had a lot of that wall text in English somewhere that she could send us. And then you think, well, why can't you just print it up? And then it's like, how much does it cost to reprint the
Right.
whole thing?
Yeah.
I mean, one solution that some museums would do would be to have it printed out in different languages, in a little envelope by each door, and so
Or like those cards.
those cards that you pull
that are-
out. But yeah, I mean, it's always a calculation of how much it costs to do
The
these.
cost again.
Yeah, exactly.
There you go.
Based on the expectation of who the visitors are.
Yeah.
And we were not their target visitor.
Yeah.
The three of us were not.
But isn't it uncanny that we began this conversation by talking about the cost
Yeah,
of our
I know.
bodies,
Yeah,
and we end
exactly.
up talking about the cost
Yeah.
of our bodies?
Well, all these things are bioethical decisions.
Yeah, makes
Yeah.
me hungry for potatoes, though.
Yeah.
I'll go double.
Potato
Add up
chips.
that, yeah.
Some of the Nazi propaganda films, I saw all of them in the Bundesarchiv. There are 9 or 10 of them, and then there's a full-length movie. You might remember the name of the
The
movie.
Black Stork, isn't it?
No, it's a
Oh.
trial. It's a feature film
Oh, yeah, about the doctor and
about
his
the doctor and his wife, and
Yeah.
she gets MS and wants
Yeah.
anyway. I can't remember the name of the film, but the rest of them are these Nazi propaganda films that look a lot like the Jewish Nazi propaganda films. But part of the rhetoric of these films, and I have some clips somewhere. I gave a paper on this somewhere. It's hard.
I think
Is
Klage an.
pictures of the
Ich klage.
people.
Ich klage
Ich
an.
klage an.
I accuse.
I
I
accuse.
accuse.
Yeah, exactly. But what the visual rhetoric, the predominant visual rhetoric of the institutions that are filmed in these propaganda films for T4 is people sitting around in care facilities eating.
Yeah.
So they show indolence. And they show people eating. And of course, the rhetoric of that is that the German Normates, the Aryans, are starving, which they probably are, while the useless eaters are literally being useless and eating
Yeah.
in these films.
And somebody is probably feeding them.
And
so
someone
they're
is
not
feeding them
eating
very
them.
often.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Taking them.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes literally with the spoon,
Mm-hmm.
but there are, these
But
people
otherwise
are
serving them, in other words.
Yeah. Around them are circulating these caretakers.
Yeah.
I'm looking at our time here. We're about to approach 50 minutes. So if we think we're going to talk longer, I should shut this down and open a new file, because
Well, let's shut
otherwise
it down
these
and
get
then
so
Decide if we have more to